February 19th, 1945, 0630 hours, Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima. The volcanic sand is black beneath their boots. Lieutenant Colonel Baron Takeichi Nishi stands at the observation post, carved into the southern slope of Suribachi, his field glasses pressed against his face. The dawn light breaks reluctantly across the Pacific, and through the lens he sees something that defies comprehension. The ocean has disappeared. Where there should be water, there is only steel, an endless armada of gray ships stretching to the horizon in every direction, their superstructures rising like the towers of some industrial nightmare. He counts 50, then 100, then stops counting. His adjutant, a young captain from Hokkaido, whispers a single word that will echo through the tunnels and caves of the island within the hour. America. But it is not the battleships that make Nishi's hand tremble. Not the cruisers with their gun turrets swiveling toward the island like the eyes of ancient gods. It is what he sees emerging from the bellies of the larger vessels. A swarm, a plague, an unstoppable tide of smaller craft lowering into the water. Landing ships, hundreds of them, then more. The Americans call them LCVPs, LSTs, LCIs, acronyms that mean nothing to Japanese ears, but everything to Japanese fate. Nishi, who won Olympic gold for Japan in Los Angeles in 1932, who dined with movie stars and shook hands with American businessmen, who thought he understood the nation across the Pacific, now realizes he understood nothing at all. He lowers his glasses and turns to his adjutant. What he says is not recorded in any official document, but survivors would later recall the essence. They are not coming to fight. They are coming to bury us under their wealth. This was Iwo Jima. This was the moment when the illusion shattered. For 3 years, the Japanese military had sustained itself on a carefully constructed narrative. The Americans, they told their soldiers, were spiritually weak, dependent on machines because they lacked the warrior spirit of Yamato. They were materialistic and soft, unwilling to die for their cause. Japanese propaganda films showed American soldiers complaining about rations, writing letters home, obsessing over creature comforts. The message was clear. When the war became hard, when the dying truly began, the Americans would collapse. Japan had the will. Japan had the spirit. Japan would endure. The officers on Iwo Jima had believed this, or wanted to believe it. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the island's garrison of 21,000 men, knew better. He had served as a military attaché in Washington in the 1920s, had traveled across America, had seen the factories of Detroit and the wheat fields of Kansas. In letters to his wife, he wrote with unusual candor, "The United States is the last country in the world Japan should fight." But even Kuribayashi, with his sober assessment of American industrial capacity, could not have imagined what now approached his island, not just in scale but in implication. What the Japanese officers saw that morning was not merely an invasion force. It was a revelation of economic theology. 880 ships. Some accounts say more. 70,000 Marines in the first wave, with another 40,000 in reserve. The pre-invasion bombardment had already consumed more ammunition than the entire Japanese garrison had in its magazines. For 3 days, American battleships and cruisers had hurled shells at the island. 22,000 tons of naval ordnance, the largest concentration of naval firepower ever directed at a single target. The Navy had promised to destroy every defensive position to make the island uninhabitable. They were wrong about that. Kuribayashi's defenses ran deep, his tunnels and caves largely untouched. But that was not the point. The point was that America could afford to be wrong. They could expend more shells in 3 days than Japan could manufacture in 6 months and still have reserves for the next battle and the one after that. Through binoculars and periscopes, from concrete bunkers and spider holes, Japanese officers watched the landing craft circle in formations, organizing themselves with mechanical precision. LSTs disgorged smaller LVTs, amphibious tractors that could crawl directly onto the beach. Command ships coordinated the assault with radio communications, a technology that Japan had never managed to integrate effectively into its own operations. Even the planning was overwhelming. The Americans had created scale models of the island, photographed every meter from reconnaissance aircraft, assigned specific beach sectors with names: Green Beach, Red Beach, Yellow Beach. They had rehearsed the landing for weeks in Hawaii. Every Marine knew his objective, his rally point, his supply chain. This was not warfare as the Japanese understood it, a clash of spirits, a test of wills. This was industrial choreography, the application of overwhelming material force with bureaucratic efficiency. In the bunkers near the eastern beaches, Major Yoshitaka Hori, the senior Imperial Japanese Army communications officer on the island, watched the first wave approach. Hori was a practical man, an engineer by training, less susceptible to the romantic notions of spirit warfare than many of his colleagues. He had tried to prepare his communications teams for what was coming, but preparation, he now understood, was a meaningless concept. The Americans were not coming with what they needed. They were coming with everything they could possibly use, and then more beyond that. As the LVTs churned through the surf, he could see the Marines inside, packed shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms clean, their equipment new. Supply vessels followed close behind, already positioned to unload before. The beach was even secured. The Americans did not believe in scarcity. They had no concept of making do. They simply brought more. The landing craft struck the beach at 0900 hours. The volcanic sand, soft and treacherous, should have been an advantage for the defenders, bogging down vehicles and men. But the Americans had anticipated this too. Combat engineers followed immediately behind the assault troops, laying metal matting, bulldozing paths, improvising solutions with the casual confidence of men who knew more materials were always available. When tanks got stuck, others pushed them free. When equipment broke, replacements appeared within hours. A Japanese officer in a cave overlooking Red Beach 1 later wrote in his diary, recovered after the battle. They treat their machines like ammunition. Use once, discard. Bring more. How do you fight an enemy who can afford to waste? What those officers were witnessing was not merely American industrial capacity, though that was staggering enough. They were witnessing a different philosophy of war, of society, of human value. The Americans brought hospital ships with surgical theaters and blood banks. They brought chaplains and psychiatrists. They brought mail from home, delivered to men, still under fire. In the chaos of the first days, as Marines died by the hundreds on the beaches, supply officers were already organizing recreation kits, ensuring that units would have playing cards and writing paper when they rotated off the line. To the Japanese defenders, starving in their tunnels, sharing rice balls and drinking water filtered through volcanic rock, this abundance was incomprehensible. It was not just that the Americans had more. It was that they believed their soldiers deserved more, that individual lives warranted this expenditure of resources. Colonel Nishi understood this better than most. In America in 1932, he had been treated as an honored guest, a celebrity athlete. He had seen how Americans lived, the casual wealth of even ordinary citizens, the cars and appliances and food, so much food. He had returned to Japan convinced that his nation was following a dangerous path. that the military's talk of spiritual superiority masked a fatal material imbalance. But even he, looking through his field glasses on that February morning, felt the weight of despair. This was not an invasion. This was mathematics made manifest. By nightfall on the first day, the Americans had landed 30,000 men and established a beachhead 200 yards deep. The cost had been terrible: 501 dead, 47 missing, 1,800 wounded. But to the Japanese, watching from their fortifications, the cost seemed irrelevant. The Americans absorbed casualties that would have crippled a Japanese regiment and simply brought more men. Reinforcements landed in darkness, guided by beacons and radio signals. Supply dumps grew on the beaches even as artillery fire fell among them. The entire operation projected an aura of inevitability, as if the outcome had been decided not by courage or tactics, but by ledger books and factory output. In the deep command bunker beneath the island's center, General Kuribayashi received reports throughout the day. His officers, their voices tight with stress, described scenes that seemed impossible. Americans calling in airstrikes on individual pillboxes, expending bombs and napalm without hesitation. Entire companies bypassing strong points, knowing that follow-on units would reduce them later. Wounded men evacuated within hours to hospital ships offshore, while Japanese wounded lay in tunnels with no morphine, no bandages, only the promise of honorable death. One officer, a captain who had attended military school in Tokyo, reportedly said to Kuribayashi, "They fight as if they have already won, as if this is not war, but procedure." And there was truth in that observation. The Americans had systematized warfare, industrialized it, turned it into a problem of logistics and supply chains. They had not come to Iwo Jima to test their spirit against Japanese spirit. They had come to process the island, to neutralize it, to remove it as a threat to their bomber campaign against the home islands. The individual heroism of Marines, and there was extraordinary heroism, acts of courage that would earn 27 medals of honor, was not incidental, but it was not the deciding factor. The deciding factor was that behind every Marine was a supply chain that stretched back to factories in Michigan and Pennsylvania, to training camps in California and North Carolina, to a society that could mobilize 12 million men and produce it all of the steel and oil and food to sustain them across 2 oceans simultaneously. The symbolic artifact of this abundance became, oddly, the ration pack. American Marines carried K rations and C rations, meals in sealed tins with cigarettes and candy, and instant coffee. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with American patrols and captured these rations were stunned. Enemy soldiers, under fire, carried chocolate. The tins were casually discarded once emptied, left on the battlefield like trash. To men who had been on half rations since 1944, who ate rice mixed with sawdust and considered it sufficient, the American approach to food was a kind of psychological warfare. It communicated, more effectively than any propaganda, the depth of the material chasm between the two nations. Some Japanese officers reported that the sight of American supply crates stacked on the beaches, thousands of them, had a more demoralizing effect on their men than the casualties inflicted by American weapons. The message was clear: you are fighting a nation that cannot be exhausted. By the 5th day of battle, as Marines pushed inland and the fighting devolved into a savage contest for bunkers and caves, Japanese radio intercepts picked up American communications that seemed surreal. Units requesting fresh uniforms for men who had been in combat for 72 hours. Supply officers coordinating the delivery of hot meals to frontline positions. Discussions about rotating exhausted companies to rear areas that already existed. complete with tents and field showers, on an island still contested by 20,000 enemy troops. For the Japanese defenders, who would fight for 36 days with no reinforcement, no resupply, no hope of evacuation, the contrast was existential. They were not losing to better soldiers. They were losing to a system that valued its soldiers differently. Lieutenant Colonel Nishi died on March 22nd, in the final days of organized resistance. The exact circumstances are unclear. Some accounts say he was killed leading a final charge, others that he died of wounds in a cave. But before his death, he reportedly gathered his surviving officers and spoke to them candidly. There are no transcripts, only recollections recorded after the war by men who escaped the island or were captured. The essence of his words, as multiple sources relate, was this: "We were taught that America was weak because it loved comfort. We did not understand that comfort is not weakness, it is power. Only a strong nation can afford to care for its soldiers. We confused cruelty with strength. And now we pay the price." This was the transformation that occurred in the minds of Japanese officers during those 36 days. The propaganda narratives crumbled against observable reality. The Americans were not soft. They were not spiritually weak. They were pragmatic, organized, and backed by a system of such overwhelming material capacity that individual courage, no matter how extraordinary, could not bridge the gap. The Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima fought with legendary tenacity. Of 21,000 defenders, fewer than 216 were captured alive. But their sacrifice did not change the outcome. It merely made the outcome more expensive for the Americans, and the Americans could afford expensive. General Kuribayashi sent his final message on March 26, 1945. "We have not eaten or drunk for 5 days, but our fighting spirit remains high." Hours later, he led his remaining soldiers in a final assault on American positions near the northern tip of the island. They carried bayonets and swords because they had no ammunition. They were cut down by machine guns and artillery. Kuribayashi's body was never identified. The battle was declared over on March 26th, though isolated Japanese soldiers continued to resist for weeks. The last two holdouts surrendered in 1949, 4 years after the war ended, emerging from caves still believing in a victory that had long since become impossible. The aftermath was instructive. American engineers began expanding the island's airfields even before the fighting ended. By March 4th, a damaged B-29 bomber made an emergency landing on Iwo Jima, the first of 2,400 such landings that would save the lives of thousands of airmen. The island became a symbol for the American public, immortalized in the eyewitness photograph of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. But for the Japanese officers who survived the war and learned of Iwo Jima's fate, the island represented something different, a lesson about the true nature of national power. In the decades that followed, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, a new generation of Japanese leaders studied the war with sober analysis. They examined not just the battles, but the systems behind them. They learned that America's strength had not been accidental or purely material. It had been structural, rooted in a society that educated its citizens, empowered its workers, and valued innovation over tradition. The very abundance that Japanese propaganda had mocked as weakness had been the source of American resilience. A nation that could feed its soldiers chocolate while waging global war was not decadent. It was formidable. The 1,000-landing craft at Iwo Jima were not just vessels. They were a message written in steel and diesel fuel, a message about the nature of modern power. They said, "We have built more than we need, and we will use all of it, and there is still more behind us." They said, Our factories outproduce your empire. Our workers outbuild your soldiers. Our system outthinks your strategy. They said, in the most fundamental terms, that the war had been decided not on the beaches of island fortresses, but in the economic and political choices made decades earlier. And so, when Japanese officers saw those 1,000 landing craft on the morning of February 19, 1945, what they said varied by rank and temperament and personal philosophy. Some prayed, some cursed, some steeled themselves for honorable death. But beneath the individual reactions was a collective realization, a truth that no propaganda could suppress. They had been lied to. America was not weak. Japan was not invincible. And the coming end would not be glorious, only inevitable. The black sand of Iwo Jima, stained with the blood of both nations, holds this truth still. Freedom and abundance are not separate concepts. They are intertwined, each enabling the other. A society that trusts its citizens to prosper will find that prosperity sustains it in times of crisis. A society that values individual life will discover that such value translates into collective strength. The Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima fought with unmatched courage for an empire that gave them only rice and bullets and the promise of death. The American Marines fought with equal courage for a nation that gave them chocolate and letters from home and the expectation of survival. Both forces bled on that volcanic rock. Only one represented a sustainable vision of human civilization. The waves still break on the beaches where the landing craft struck. The caves where Japanese officers whispered their disbelief are silent now, filled with volcanic dust and memory. But the lesson remains, carved into history as deeply as the names on memorials. An empire built on sacrifice alone cannot defeat. A republic built on shared prosperity. A military sustained by honor alone cannot overcome a military sustained by logistics and care and the industrial power of a free people. What the Japanese officers saw at Iwo Jima was not merely American strength. It was the future, arriving in 1,000 landing craft, unstoppable as the tide.